Hello, everybody. Welcome to the series of online events, INFRA Plus, Infrastructure for Fragmented Cities, organized by the University of Manchester. Today's event focuses on the topic of friction in relation to infrastructure. Before introducing the speakers and going into their presentations, I will briefly introduce myself, the rationale of the event, and the structure. My name is Mark Stanoff. I'm an architect working in London. I'm starting a PhD soon at the University of Manchester. I will be chairing the event today. The key question of the series of events is how can infrastructure be chosen, planned, designed, implemented, maintained, enhanced, and used to improve well-being in formal and informal urban areas. This seminar series aims to identify links between context-specific infrastructural challenges, approaches to their solution, and universal mechanisms towards improved sustainability. Speakers from across academia and practice, focusing on Middle East and Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, will present their unique disciplinary perspective and propose transdisciplinary directions for future research. Today we have two speakers, Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay and Paul Raven. Be aware that today's session is being recorded and it can subsequently be viewed on YouTube and on other channels. Unless there's anything else to add, I'll introduce Bodhisattva, or Bodhi, who's our first speaker. After his talk, we'll see if there are any questions on the chat. Please feel free to post them on the questions and answers panel. If we don't have any pressing questions at that point, I'll introduce Paul, and then we'll have hopefully more of a discussion from questions relating to both talks at the end of the session. So I'll introduce our first speaker, Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, Bodhi, who is Associate Professor in the Global Culture Studies at the University of Oslo in Norway. He leads the international research group Co-Futures. He's the leader of the European Research Council project Co-Futures Pathways to Possible Present and Norwegian Research Council project Science Functionality. His website is www.cofutures.org, and the title of Bodhi's presentation today is Speculative Futures of the Global South Infrastructures. Over to you, Bodhi.
Thank you, Mark. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the introduction. I'll start by sharing my screen. I think that's probably the first thing to be done here. Also, there, is it full screen? Yes. Should be, right? Hi, everyone. I'm Bodhi. I'm going to talk about speculative futures of global South infrastructures. And, so the first, so there's also, of course, my email and my Twitter link there for the project if anybody is interested. But yeah, so speculative futures of global South infrastructures. There's a lot of terms in there, right? There's speculative, there's infrastructure, there's future, there's global South. There's, of course, also the underlying theme that this is a future fictions panel, right? So, so all these terms, what do they mean? And why are we talking about, future fictions or science fiction for the matter in this series? So, I guess the reason I'm kind of part of this series is because of Deliana, who leads the SUS-INFRA project. It's because we have been talking about different ways of thinking with science fiction and future fictions for quite a while. So what I'm going to present today is some of my research, some of my work that I've been engaged in this particular way of thinking or way of dealing things as part of the Co-Futures project and Science Fictionality project. So without much more introduction, let's just jump to those terms: speculative, infrastructure, future, global south, and fictions. Yes. So I want to turn to some, old views of science fiction here, and this idea of what science fiction does. So I'm looking at like a couple of views from the 50s. There's a third view, which is the last one, which is all characters in this novel are fictitious, except possibly the Martians, but that I inserted as a joke quote, really, on how we think of reality and realism. So Bernard Wolfe, who is actually the first author to properly use cybernetics in science fiction, 2 years after Norbert Wiener's book in Limbo. And he says that, anybody who is painting a picture of some coming year is kidding, right? So anybody who's really writing science fiction and talking about the future is really kidding. He's fancying up something in the present or the past and not really blueprinting the future. That is, all such writing is essentially satiric, today-centered, and not utopic or tomorrow-centered, right? So what Limbo is, the future that Limbo presents, is really a riff of 1950, what 1950 might have been like if it kept on being 1950, right? Only more and more so for 4 more decades. Right? So that's one kind of perspective that we have on fiction, that it is that what you see as science fiction or what you think of as science fiction is essentially a satire, that it is today-centered and not utopic, tomorrow-centered, right? As a contrast view, one could almost have Raymond Williams, who is another classic Marxist theorist, and he says he has written quite a bit on science fiction, and in one of these pieces, classic pieces, he says, well, fiction is a kind of fact, although it takes some people centuries to get used to it. To point out that his substance is imaginary or fantastic is no criticism of it, for that is the kind of fact it is, a thing man has thought or imagined rather than observed or made. Now, this is actually very much a classic Marxist position, of how you would understand consciousness, really, but also it goes back to people like Vico, who has been an influence on Marx, long movement there, but Vico's idea of verum ipsum factum, to make is to know, right? So fiction is a form of making and also a form of creating facts. Right. So that's Raymond Williams's perspective. When we jump to the 1960s, you have somebody like Ursula Le Guin, who says, well, science fiction is often described as extrapolative, but it is not, right? And she says that strictly extrapolative works of science fiction generally arrive about where the Club of Rome arrives, somewhere between the gradual extinction of human liberty and the total extinction of terrestrial life. Right? And then she says that it's not really about extrapolation, right? It's really something else. It is what she calls a thought experiment, right? And the purpose of that thought experiment is not to predict the future, but to describe reality, the present world. So it is not predictive, it is descriptive. Stanislaw Lem also takes off something similar, but Lem, owing to his specific the specific influence of technicity in Lem's work, he's much more concerned with the way that science fiction can point out real problems. So he says, as in life, we solve real problems with the help of images of non-existent beings, so in literature, we can signal the existence of real problems with the help of prima facie impossible occurrences or objects. So even when the happenings it describes are totally impossible, a science fiction work may still point out meaningful, indeed rational problems. So those of you who are familiar with Lem's work, we are celebrating a Lem centenary year this year. But in a book like Solaris, for instance, where Lem is talking about the impossibility of communication with a being that is not oneself, right? So there are ways of dealing with rational problems of society, of social order, even when the setting or whatever you're imagining is completely unrealistic, right? So these are some of the views that when we talk about the term speculative, so these are some of the ideas of the speculative that we're kind of playing with in science fiction. And I've gone to some older views because these have been in a way foundational for the way people have thought about science fiction. And I'm going to move in the direction of contemporary SF very, very quickly, but I wanted to signal this as kind of a backdrop. So what all these offer us is basically what my team and I call narrative as a heuristic toolkit. So it's not just science fiction, it is the idea of narrative itself, right? And when we are discussing specifically science fiction, because we can deal with metaphysical issues here, but also questions of what constitutes the realism of realist fiction. So this is why this is a general kind of a way of talking about narrative as a heuristic toolkit rather than science fiction specifically as a heuristic toolkit, right? So these are some of the kinds of ways in which one can engage with or think with science fiction or think with infrastructure and science fiction. So there's sandboxing, for instance, and you can like take elements or remove elements. So you create a model and then you isolate elements of that model and see how the system behaves when you take out elements of that model. Right. Prediction is something we already dealt with. Description is also something we already dealt with, but there's also other kinds of ways of thinking. For instance, prototyping. Prototype fiction is also a kind of science fiction or future fiction. That is, you create prototypes. For instance, utopian fiction is often a prototype for an ideal society. Right. Anticipation. So there's a lot of quibble as to what and how anticipation is different from prediction. Prediction is a much more active act. Anticipating is a much more passive act. Then you also have fiction as diagnosis or diagnosing problems, right? So this is kind of like a larger model that we are working with, that several others in the group, Tune Gadmar, for instance, she has worked on the idea of sandboxing in science fiction and so on. So this is something that is a group model that we are dealing with in our project. So next term that we are going to try and jump to is infrastructures, right? So when I use the term infrastructures, it's kind of like a very loose way of talking about many different things that underlie the functioning of societies, also specifically of cities, but also societies in general. So there's resource availability, there's resource circulation, and resource control. And these are some of the infrastructures that I'm going to talk about today as well in the context of Global South infrastructures. So resource availability, for instance, I put under that energy, food, wealth. This is also a model that is being developed by my project in terms of infrastructures. Right. So I'm going to talk a bit about the environment today, and also, primarily resource circulation. I'm going to focus on resource circulation for the most part today. But why are we dealing with this? Well, the reason to focus on Global South infrastructures is because of the disparity in consumption, right? Per capita consumption and production of, CO2 emissions and so on. And you'll see that the richest 10% produce 49% of emissions, global emissions, and, the poorest 50% are responsible for only around 10% of total lifestyle consumption emissions and so on. So you have these kinds of charts, right, which basically say that, well, it's not really, population is not really the problem, which is often used as an argument to talk about the global south, well, look at your population. It's population that's the problem. There are different ways of looking at consumption patterns and so on, which can challenge those things, as we are all familiar with. So Greendex, for instance, is relatively older, but it's still another one of those frameworks where you have, where you see like, consumer Greendex, then Brazil, India, and China are the top countries, in terms of sustainable lifestyles. This is because, per capita emission is actually much lower than what you find in the global north. So this is kind of one of the reasons for focusing on global south infrastructures, right? So what is it that we are really talking about when we are talking about global south infrastructures in my model? So my co-futures model is very strongly based on global south futures, global south future fictions. And the reason for doing so, we have already seen one, which is the more scientific statistical kind of a thing related to consumption and emissions. But the other thing is the explosion of futurisms that have happened in the last 20 years, primarily around the global south in terms of future fictions. There's a huge amount of future fiction being produced in the global south. Science fiction films, if you want to call them science fiction, there are films, there are video games, there are comic books, there are, of course, literature, books. There's interactive fiction. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of ways in which these futures are being produced in the global south. And these numbers are actually pretty mind-boggling. So I won't go into the numbers today, but they are pretty mind-boggling. Think of increases by 1,000, 1,500, 2,000% in certain regions of the world in the global south. So my project, what it does is that it kind of like explores this, going all the way from, not my project, the project team explores this all the way from, Latin America to China, to India, to Africa, Middle East, and so on, right? So it kind of distributes all of this. And then what it does is that it looks at all of these, it looks at these infrastructures, looks at what kinds of things are proposed and suggested by these new future fictions. What are they dealing with? What kinds of problems are they dealing with? And we'll see that the problems they're dealing with are pretty much the same problem. I'll come back to that slide later. But you have climate change, you have demographic change, and you have technological change. These are kinds of three major drivers of all these things that these global south future fictions are dealing with. So when we talk about speculative futures of global south infrastructure, we are talking specifically about them in terms of these resource availability, resource circulation, and resource control, and their futures, right? So to give an example of this, we have trash. Trash is one of my favorite examples of everything, but here we have some models of trash. So these are some recent reports and so on, like that. The first one is from Guyu in China, is the Greenpeace report, which is that it's an e-waste nightmare. Right. Then you have the Mumbai fires, the garbage fire, which can be seen from space, like, so. And finally, you have, the third image that you have there is Beirut's, Lebanon's river of trash from a few years ago. And you can see that it actually flows like a river because of, garbage collection problems and so on. So this theme of waste, right? So a lot of global north and global south, the distinctions between these are actually not quite, these are basically developmental paradigms, right? And for the large part, the way the idea of development is constructed, the idea of development is really about the removal of trash. It's really about removing things that stink. So when you talk about development and development of the global north, it's where have these resources, where has the trash been dumped, right? Where has it been moved? So when we talk about, for instance, a place like Guyu, where you have, the world's electronic trash goes to be broken down, or these huge ships which go to be broken down in Southeast Asia or Bangladesh, so you have these consumption patterns, and you have these production patterns, and you have these movement patterns of resources being dumped elsewhere, right? So the global north, or the kind of development paradigm that we're talking about, and why global south future fictions tend to deal with themes like this, is also because of the kinds of inequality that you have between the development models and expectations of these from these developmental models that you have in different parts of the world, right? So here you have kind of an image of recent science fiction where you have a lot of presentation of, amongst other things, trash. So Chen Qiufan's Waste Tide, which is kind of the top book over there, is actually set, is the place is called Silicon Isle, and it's actually based on Guyu from the previous slide. So there's a lot of work that is being produced right now, so which is coming from all over. And these are, several of these are works and translations, but you also find them in other parts of the world. So I put Maya Linde's History of the Bees there simply as an indicator to the larger field of climate fictions. And then you have different kinds of models of, trash turning into, fashion, or you have the shanty mega structures of Olaleka and Dreyfus, and so on, right? So all of these new future fictions, these futurisms that I'm talking about, these are things from the last 20 years. So here's what the co-features framework is really about. It's stuff that has developed over the last 10 years, more or less, but it is trying to make sense of an outsized, or what Garcia Marquez called an outsized reality, right? That you cannot describe the reality of these regions within the existing models of realist fiction, right? So magic realism, for instance, is kind of one way of talking about, this outsized reality, right? Magic realism or magical realism, but so is science fiction, right? So science fiction, as several people have argued, Vandana Singh, for instance, is a way of talking about, or a way of making sense of this outsized reality, the reality of climate change, the reality of demographic change, the reality of technological change, right? So this is the framework that we are working with. So to give an example of one kind of model that has been doing a lot of this, in the sense of that it deals with climate fiction a lot. It is a form of climate fiction, and a lot of it comes from the global south, is solar punk, right? But these are some translations and English language anthologies. A lot of solar punk is actually produced now in Latin America. There's also some in the African continent, and there are also some in Asia, and I expect more to come in the next years, actually. So solar punk is one such genre, right? But solar punk is somewhat optimistic. And this is one of the interesting things about a lot of these global south futurisms, that they actually skew optimistic. Okorafor, who is an African futurist writer, so Okorafor says, well, African futurism skews optimistic, right? And a lot of these fictions actually skew optimistic, which is kind of a weird thing to say when we are talking about, realities of trash and so on, right? So how can fictions coming from these contexts skew optimistic, right? But they do. So, the Indian writer Samit Basu, my friend, he said this in a panel we organized a couple of years ago in the before times. He said, well, how do you deal with dystopia in a place where dystopia is just Tuesday, right? So by necessity, dystopias are somewhat boring. So you kind of need to be able to think differently, right? And that is what a lot of these global South fictions do, right? So they are offering a model, a way of thinking, which is in blasted landscapes, if you want to use that term. It's in blasted landscapes of the Anthropocene, right? But it's trying to do something more. It's trying to think of other ways of being, other ways of living, right? So hence the optimism of Solarpunk. But I want to end this by talking very briefly about one of those resources, and that is water. So I'm going to talk a bit about water futures. I've selected 4 short films, really. All of them are short films. So, and all of them are available online to watch. You can watch them if you like. They range from like 25 minutes to 30 minutes long. So water scarcity is one of the big issues that you find in a lot of these future fictions. We were talking about resource control and so on earlier, so water was one of them. So a lot of these works deal with water futures. The reason I have selected films here and not literature, I could have just as easily picked some books, but is to show you the visual aesthetic and the kind of style that a lot of these global South futurisms are employing. We can also discuss books later if anyone is interested. So the first one, Pumzi, or Breath, is perhaps the most famous one, directed by Wanuri Kahiu, was a Kenyan director. From 2009. It's a very famous film. It's a film in which you have kind of a closed dystopian enclave. It's very sterilized and so on. People recycle everything, every bit of water, because the world outside, the planet outside, is completely desertified, right? And the protagonist is somebody who keeps dreaming of this tree that exists out there, but it is a dream. So it begins with this kind of a dream of this green tree that blooms or that rises in the desert, right? But people are not allowed to dream, so the moment anybody dreams, like, dream has been detected, so you have to take your dream suppressants, right? So you are not allowed to dream of a positive future. You are not allowed to dream of a world that exists outside the sterility of the enclave. So the protagonist, obviously, she does take her dream suppressants and so on and so forth. This is a scene where water is being recycled, so it's like all bodily water needs to be recycled. There is an obligatory museum scene that you find in a lot of future fictions, which is kind of like a description of the before times. Now I'm using before times in the sense of science fiction. Right, that there used to be a world, right? So there goes the last tree, the tree is gone. Museum scenes are a common thing in science fiction, and a colleague of mine had, in the project, has written on museological futures and so on. But there is so this obligatory scene that you have in the enclave, there goes the last tree, right? So the protagonist, of course, wants, because of different things, they are identifying or working on soil samples from the outside, and they want to go and they want to see what's happening outside, but obviously they can't go because the exit visa is denied and so on. Ultimately, they do manage to escape. They go out into the nuclear waste in this vast desert space, carrying this little plant, which they water with the last of their water. They lie down next to the plant, giving it some shade. And as the movie ends, this plant is blooming from her body, right? So this is how the movie ends. It's green. The world is green again, right? Another movie, which the director might take issue with me for calling it science fictional, but it definitely has some of those ideas in it, is the Tanzanian Indian short film Tiwa Kivuli, or The Shadow Tree, which is from 2014. So this almost has the tone of a documentary. In Africa, 300 million people live in a water-stressed environment. So you like, bang, in this 10-minute film, first scene, bang, you know what this is going to be about, right? So water is polluted, there's trash and so on. Nothing really grows there. The protagonist is this boy, and the boy sees a couple of fish that he really wants in the water, that he really wants to save. But his mother says, you know, that fish need clean water to survive, and you don't have clean water. So how can you get clean water? So the fish dies. He goes out to get clean water from different sources, but everywhere you have these cola bottles and so on, right? All the clean water has been turned into cola, into soda. Goes to a recycler, and they are of course not willing to give him any water either. So finally he uses the scientific technique of transpiration, that plants can produce water by covering this plant in a plastic sheet and using plants transpiration to generate the clean water for the fish. So, but where it becomes interesting is like he finds this water, and then he goes about and he's like, oh, he's so happy that the fish finally have clean water, and he goes running, and when he runs, somehow he drops the little bottle the plastic bottle that he's carrying. So it seems to be like the end of the world, that, all this effort for nothing. But the movie ends once again, like, he gets up, dusts himself off, takes the plastic sheet and goes back again to the tree. Right? So that's how it ends. This kind of a positive ending in such a water stressed environment, that you will keep using this, right? There is a lot to be said on low cost innovation, which I don't want to go into, and how speculative infrastructures from the global south focus on low cost infrastructures, but we don't have time to go into that. Yet another one that I want to briefly mention is the movie Sandstorm. It's actually not a Chinese film. It's an Australian director who shot the film in China, and the movie also stars Ai Weiwei, who ultimately expressed their dissatisfaction with the film and had a row with the director and so on. So it's an Australian film. It's not a Chinese film, but it's set in China. And again, the imaginary is the same, that you have certain spaces, which have water, certain spaces which don't, apartment buildings which have water, but the world outside is completely damaged and destroyed. And there is really no water. So people have these little plastic bottles, and taking a shower is a huge thing, so on. So there's a whole plot, unraveling on water usage, infidelity, and all of that happening in there. But the person who's coming in there with the 2 water cans, that's Weiwei. So this is the indicator that it has run out of water, so on, right? So there's water riots going on outside. Citizens are advised to remain calm. Talk of what's the street price for smuggled water and so on, right? So there is a lot of this kind of what is going to happen to the water, that the air is polluted, so you're wearing masks outside. But again, this movie too ends with this kind of a strange narrative where the character follows this the water bearer person all the way to the outskirts of the city. So the city is kind of like this this is the damaged, barren wasteland, it seems like. Yet in this damaged, barren wasteland, you have this little dome, this gazebo, which is kind of a greenhouse. And in the middle of all this waste, there is green, right? So it ends on this note. The last movie I kind of quickly want to point out is Carbon, which is from 2017. It's an Indian film. This is in terms of plot, this is somewhat more futuristic in the sense that you have ideas of different planets and so on and so forth, colonization, but nonetheless, it's still, dealing with very severe shortages. So the movie starts with the year 2051, that it is all destroyed and damaged. And this is like, space debris and space trash floating everywhere. The earth is completely muddy. There's no green here, right? Goes further, year 2067, even more so, right? And cut to New Delhi, which is, the capital, and you have this kind of a horrifying scenery that it's completely orange and polluted and toxic, right? So everyone has to wear these masks when they go outdoors and so on and so forth. This is, shooting some Delhi metro scenes and so on. So these are so people are smuggling, selling oxygen. So pro athletes regularly use supplemental oxygen. So here's boost, feel better, recover faster, improve performance. Now the thing is, oxygen, COVID has made a lot of these, supposedly science fictional scenarios. If anybody has been following the news, then the kind of oxygen shortages that we have had in India and are having in India right now with COVID, right? So this does not, the pollution and some of that might seem futuristic, but a lot of that is so every day, right? So you need to be able to imagine a different world. Hence the importance of optimism that I mentioned earlier. So oxygen is an industry. Because of all this pollution, your supply of oxygen will run out and so on. This is the state. Now, anybody who has, seen pictures of bomb towns and so on will know what this looks like. This is an aesthetic that is used in a lot of science fiction, apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic films, to show destroyed townscapes and so on, right? Ruined landscapes. On the other side, there's Mars, right? So that those who are familiar with Elon Muskian dreams of living on Mars, then you have this kind of, your home on the red planet. Mars is ready for possession and so on and so forth, right? So the protagonist is somebody who goes to Mars, who is kind of like one of these illegal suppliers and is, ends up in a little bit of an altercation and so on. Anyway, so the Martians have been hoarding all this water, this oxygen and all of that. They've been hoarding all of it. So the protagonist discovers that hoard, and people don't hesitate to spill blood for a glass of water and so on. And then finally the protagonist and this woman who's been kind of trapped in this environment, they go out and there's this Martian city landscape. But the interesting thing is that the Martian city landscape morphs into planet Earth. And what it does with planet Earth is that it shows that, that this is the future, turn back the clock, right? So the clock starts turning back. So year 2038, it becomes cleaner. And then year 2017, this is where we are. And then, and then the movie ends with, like we Indians have a thing for Mahatma Gandhi. So it ends with a quote by Mahatma Gandhi: "The future depends on what we do in the present," right? So this kind of a narrative, this arc that these future fictions take, like you have shortage of water and so on and so forth, but the future, the structures of the future depend on what we do now, which kind of ties together several of the ideas that we've been talking about. Like, why are Global South fictions interested in speculative futures, in speculative infrastructures? The reason for that is that speculation allows a space of generation, allows a space of creativity that can challenge dystopian thinking and dystopian frameworks of the present, right? So it can serve all the I'm gonna go back to that slide. I should have put it at the end too, but yes, that's a lot of slides. So I think so when we had this this slide here, like sandboxing, predicting, describing. So this is kind of what these global South fictions are doing. They are describing problems, they're diagnosing problems, they're anticipating, they're prototyping, they're speculating, they're predicting, they're also sandboxing, they're also challenging, right? So this is the kind of function that global South future fictions have. And speculation becomes, or speculative thinking or speculative infrastructures, thinking in terms of speculative infrastructures becomes a necessity, you know, in conditions where you wouldn't be able to think otherwise. And that's kind of where I'm going with this whole framework. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bodhi, for that presentation. Certainly very interesting to hear how much of the modern science fiction takes an optimistic stance, which I wasn't aware of. And it's great to hear about that. I don't believe we have any questions as of yet on the question chat. So we'll go straight to the poll after I present him briefly, and then we'll have more questions. We'll have questions at the end. Dr. Paul Raven who's our second speaker, is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at Lund University, Sweden, where he researches the narrative rhetorics of socio-technical and climate imaginaries. His doctoral thesis proposed a novel model of socio-technical change based on social practice theory and a narrative prototyping methodology for infrastructure foresight. He is also an author and critic of science fiction, an occasional journalist and essayist, a collaborator with designers and artists, and gratefully allows consulting critical futurists. He currently lives in Malmö with a cat, some guitars, and sufficient books to constitute an insurance invalidating fire hazard. Something that in my job keeps me awake, at least fire hazard. Anyway, Paul, over to you.
Thank you. Just let me get my slides up. Here we go. How does that look? Okay, I'm going to assume that all is good.
Yeah, looks good.
And fantastic. I will begin. I'd like to begin by saying thanks to you all for coming to hear us talk today. After a year of little else, a few hours on Zoom that you don't have to do is a pretty big ask. I appreciate the gift of your time. Thanks also to Diana and the INFRA+ team for the invitation to talk. I hope I have not abused the privilege. Looking at the list of panels and papers on the INFRA+ schedule has been heartening, but also daunting. On the first point, it's a delight to see so much good work being done on infrastructure. When I began my own work in this field a little under a decade ago, it still felt very dominated by tech-centric perspectives, and doing social research seemed like an uphill struggle. Though with hindsight, that had a lot to do with my accidentally ending up doing a PhD in a civil engineering department after having done a master's in science fiction, and then finding that I had the instincts, if not the training, of a social theorist. On the second point, it's daunting because the breadth and granularity of the work being discussed here at INFRA+ is spectacular, and I cannot hope to match any of it, partly because my current work is more focused on socio-technical change and futures in a much broader sense, but also partly because of that theoretical inclination I've already mentioned. As such, I'm taking this opportunity to try out a theoretical experiment that I've had in rough note form for some time. I would like you to see this not as an opposition to or deviation from the case studies and specific analyses that many of the other presenters have discussed. Rather, I'm offering a framework, a sort of metaphorical trellis, within which such cases might be arranged and connected and multiplied. Theory is inherently abstract, of course, but what's interesting about doing theory in this field is that it shows that the abstract is not necessarily above the concrete. Theory and abstraction can also be chthonic and explore beneath things, which is a different sort of beyond. Nor in this case are the abstract and the concrete necessarily oppositional forms, as I will soon explain. So to put it another way, we might say that I'm offering a conceptual infrastructure for thinking about infrastructure. And I'm going to begin by returning to science fiction for a trope that can help us think about infrastructures more broadly. Science fiction, or SF, can be seen as a cultural expression of the way we think socio-technicality and futurity. As such, this particular trope, which has, not at all coincidentally, fallen somewhat out of fashion in SF in recent years, stands well for an attitude towards the infrastructural that prevailed throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, but which has started to fall away. That trope is known as the big dumb object. So I will begin by reading the definition of the big dumb object from the ever-reliable TV Tropes website. Something huge has been spotted on the edge of uncharted space. It's miles long with a maw that could swallow a dozen starships. It could hold a crew of tens of thousands or a crew of thousands 10 miles tall. It's on a direct course for our solar system, and we need you to investigate it. Such is the big dumb object. It's really, really big and really, really powerful. It could be a weapon or a habitat. The big dumb object is always technologically more incredible than anything the discoverers have ever seen before. Sometimes it's disguised as a natural phenomenon. Its makers may be alive in a far-off remote region. They may have ascended to a higher plane of existence, and this object is nothing more than leftover dust in comparison to their new existence. They may have gone extinct, and this object may be the last artifact of their society. The object may be some device or even an organ used by starfish aliens to devour other worlds. It's even possible that the object is an alien. For those with only a passing familiarity with science fiction media, I invite you to think of the Death Star from the Star Wars franchise, a machine the size of a moon or a small planet. But now imagine that rather being crammed full of people running around in weird plastic armor, it is instead empty and abandoned, and hence semantically silent. It may well be functional, if in need of some repairs, but in the absence of the teleological purpose of its makers and operators, it would appear to someone who stumbled across it as a vast puzzle, an artifact whose purpose might only be discerned by exploration and study. I should note here that the big dumb object is predominantly a literary trope rather than a cinematic one for a whole bunch of reasons. That has rather limited the range of well-known examples I might use, which means, chalk one up to the experimental method in this case, I guess. But we can discuss some of the examples later on, perhaps. So the starting point of my argument today is that we who study infrastructure are somewhat like the characters who encounter big dumb objects in science fiction novels, trying to determine the meaning and function of their totality through various paradigms of investigation and exploration. Now, to reiterate, this is a theoretical experiment on my part, and I should note clearly that despite having been a writer and critic of science fiction for far longer than I have been a theorist of infrastructure, I did not come up with this metaphorical device on my own. Rather, I was inspired by a 2019 paper by Reino Isto in Open Philosophy, in which he deploys the big dumb object as a metaphor for working in the young philosophical paradigm known as object-oriented ontology, or triple O. Triple O is closely related to flat ontology social theories, for example, actor network theory, social practice theory, which is one reason the paper piqued my interest. But I'm not going the full philosophical distance here today. My aim is instead to make the same metaphorical leap that Isto makes, but in a more instrumental and applied fashion, namely thinking about infrastructure in particular. Isto argues that triple O thinkers have sought to think with very large objects precisely for the ways that they enable us to move beyond both narratives of master objects and divisions between subjectivity and objecthood. And it's that division in theoretical approaches to infrastructure that I'm interested in bridging myself. Isto also quotes Timothy Morton's concept of the hyperobject, massively distributed in time and space in ways that baffle humans and make interacting with them fascinating, disturbing, problematic, and wondrous. And further notes that such a concept allows philosophy to both grapple with the undeniable agency of objects and to account for forms of experience after the end of any meaningful phenomenological horizon like the world. Now, I want to avoid the deep weeds of things like phenomenology, at least for today. But I think Isto's instinct that the BDO is a good metaphorical figure for the hyperobject is likewise useful for those of us working with infrastructure, which in my own conceptualization is also very much a hyperobject. One of Morton's examples makes the case quite well, I think, in that he suggests that climate change is a hyperobject. Behind that term, he says, lies an immense collection of materials, actors, and events, which is almost incomprehensible in its size and complexity. That climate change is a hyperobject is important to my thinking in more than one way. As I will argue later on, I see the infrastructural hyperobject as a subsystem of the climate change hyperobject, indeed as completely inextricable from it. But the BDO is perhaps an even better metaphor for the infrastructural hyperobject in particular, because the one defining feature of a BDO is its builtness. The BDO is always, almost by definition, an artifact, something that has been made, but whose makers are present only through their absence. Isto cites Fred Sharman in order to point out that the dumb in BDO does not mean stupid or lacking intelligence, nor, despite enduring prejudices against science fiction in some places, does it mean trivial. Rather, the dumbness is a sort of semantic silence. To quote Isto again, the mystery surrounding the origins, uses and meanings of the high projects in question, which dumbfounds the characters who encounter it, and ideally the readers who read about them, by the inexplicability of their function and their relation to existing models of space and time. So that's all well and good for philosophy, but what about those of us studying infrastructure for less abstract reasons? I invite you to think again of Isto's point about grappling with the undeniable agency of objects. He also observes in a footnote that one goal of IIIO philosophy is to converge on a conceptual space between two prevailing analytical approaches. On the one hand, the reductionism of scientific naturalism, in which things can be seen as aggregations of ever smaller things, and on the other hand, social constructivism, in which things are constructions of human activity. Both of these perspectives are useful, to be clear. The instinct of IIIO, which I find to be applicable to our work on infrastructure in a slightly more empirical way, is that some compromise or fusion of those perspectives can get us past some of the limitations inherent in each of them. To illustrate that point, here's one last quote from Isto on the BDO's power as a metaphor. It is often so large and or so distant, but it is clearly impossible to encounter as a unified whole. At the same time, its component parts and surfaces, often portals and points of access, themselves appear as strangely incomplete translations of the BDO as a whole. Their functions are strange or out of touch with what the whole appears to be and do. That, to me, is infrastructure to a T. But to make that connection clearer to you, I need to briefly state my own ontology of infrastructure. As already noted, approaches to infrastructure studies have been revolutionized in recent years by the adoption of a more relativistic conceptualization of the term, which arguably stems from the work of Starr and Boker, and particularly from Starr's justly famed ethnography of infrastructure paper. To be absolutely clear, I am not arguing against this approach, far from it. The relativization of infrastructure has opened up the question of socio-technicality, and I celebrate it for that reason, among many others. Nonetheless, I do feel that it has resulted in an analytical paradigm in which almost anything could be infrastructural to anything else, which from a systems thinking perspective is not exactly false. Due to my research having been shaped by working among civil engineers, however, I have a particular interest in committing to the infra of infrastructure, to always looking at what lies beneath. It is well and good to think of IT systems or cloud computing data centers as infrastructural to a given organizational practice. But my point is that there are often deeper and more fundamental systems propping these systems up from beneath. These are what I call, with the pun very much intended, concrete infrastructures: roads, railways, pipelines, pylons, power stations, many more. The concrete infrastructures can be defined by function in that they are fundamentally logistical. They enable the transportation and or transmutation of resources, which may be material or informational or human. They can also be distinguished from the technologies of interface which they support by their immobility. Concrete infrastructure is always an intervention in the landscape. So a road is a concrete infrastructure, but in my schema, a car or a truck is not. If it can move, it is an interface, though many interfaces count as infrastructures under the more relativistic approach already discussed. I don't have time today to unpack this ontology other than to note that it is derived from the same practice theoretical perspectives I will shortly be discussing. We can dig into it in the Q&A if time allows, or those curious to know more might take a look at my 2018 paper entitled Renarrating the Societal Cyborg in People, Place and Policy. There'll be a link in the slides later. But one final point needs to be made before we can move on, and that is, this is the point that connects concrete infrastructure to the metaphor of the big dumb object. The concrete infrastructures are fundamentally and inextricably interconnected and interdependent. Now, this was not planned, it was more an inevitable function of their co-evolution of design, as each successive infrastructure, roads, navigational alterations to rivers, canals, railways, gas networks, electricity grids, telephony, the internet, all of these things took the existence of the others as a condition of their own functional design. We've had this interdependency illustrated very clearly for us over the last couple of years, and the drama of the Ever Given in the Suez Canal a few months ago was perhaps the most widely reported upon. But it's been plain to see for much longer than that if you were looking out for it. Logistics is an entirely global network of interdependency, a network the size of the world, a network of networks. I refer to the inextricable tangle of concrete infrastructure as the metasystem, the system of systems. And it is in that sense that I think of infrastructure, concrete infrastructure in particular, though not exclusively by any means, as a hyper-object, as a big dumb object. We can just about find meaning in isolated parts of it through careful study. But the vastness, the sublimity, the mystery of its totality remains persistently elusive. Its components, whether material or human, have individual agency, but there is a rather more inscrutable sense of its own agency, the emergent behaviors of countless interwoven systems expressing something which may or may not be a mind, philosophically speaking, but which nonetheless acts, which acts not only in the world, but also on the world, and which is furthermore coextensive with the world. It is as much a part of our world as the sky or the sea or the soil. So far, so abstract, right? But like Isto says, by thinking with hyperobjects, we can start to untangle issues such as the subject-object distinction, which in our line of work expresses in the dichotomy between reductionist and constructionist perspectives. What I aim to show today is how thinking between these paradigms, or perhaps more fairly, shuttling between one view and the other, by starting with the concrete specificity of human agency and moving all the way out to the abstract totality of the metasystem, we can begin to bypass the problematics of scale and of the subject-object distinction, and therefore make a clear connection between human agency and its effects on the world. Or, more simply, and as some have suggested to me somewhat arrogantly, which may be a fair accusation, I propose that we can rethink our understanding of socio-technical change itself, throwing out determinisms both social and material for something more dialectical and ecological. So I'm going to move fairly fast through this stuff, partly because I'm assuming many listeners here today will already be familiar with it, but there are references to follow if you want to dig into it further. I will begin with the observation that understanding the dynamics of socio-technical change is necessary for dealing with climate change and with other issues of collective environmental justice. Understanding how socio-technicality changes improves our understanding of how we ended up in the situation we're in and how we might change that situation in the future. Certainly, as far as policy-facing research in the global north is concerned, research on socio-technical change is dominated by transitions theory, and in particular the so-called multi-level perspective. I could spend many words on picking holes in the MLP and other supply-side theories of socio-technical change, as my doctoral examiners know all too well, but others have done it far better than I have, so I will simply refer to a few of my favourite touchstones. Foremost among them is Donna Haraway, whose essay on situated knowledges should be an essential read for anyone working on infrastructure. It's crammed full of brilliant analysis, but the image that is perhaps most pertinent to this discussion is that of the God trick, which is Haraway's term for the positivist managerial view from above, which mistakenly believes itself to be an objective view from nowhere, which is common to the so-called hard sciences, but by no means exclusive to them. In the context of infrastructure and urbanism in particular, the metaphorical equivalent of the God trick vision would be a GIS model or an architect's maquette of a proposed new development. The work of Elizabeth Shove at Lancaster, with a cast of colleagues and co-writers over the years, is also invaluable. Shove has observed that studies of socio-technical change, as exemplified by, but not limited to, the MLP, often are founded on the behaviorist model of Homo economicus, the every person consumer who makes rational decisions between alternative products or services in a market of options, and who thus just needs to be educated as to which is the most rational choice in order to address whatever problematic consumption behaviors are currently in the frame. This approach is closely related to what science communication scholars refer to as the information deficit model, which claims that people don't change behaviors which contribute to, say, climate change because they just don't know enough about how their behaviors contribute to climate change. In order to get past this way of looking at the world that assumes people are simultaneously impeccably rational yet woefully ignorant, we have to dump the model of Homo economicus, and we have to stop looking down from the position of supposed objectivity into an architect's scale model of the systems we're studying. The behaviorist model and models like the NLP are fundamentally supply-side theories. They are theories in which the actions of producers, transition managers, policymakers, and other such inhabitants of boardrooms are the ones with agency, the ones who shape the infrastructural regime, which is in itself is a tellingly authoritarian concept. To be clear, the actions of such actors certainly have their role to play. My point is that they are far from the only actors of interest, and I would also suggest in passing that the assumption that they are the only actors of interest might be a fully unintended side effect of an enduring methodological bias in transition studies towards the elite interview. And if you'll excuse me a second, I think this is an appropriate slide at which to have a drink of water of my own. Thank you. So, to counter this theoretical and methodological bias, a demand-side perspective upon socio-technical change is required. There are many ways to make the case, but this is mine. If we're interested in the question of how and why technologies and infrastructures change over time, then we have to start with the question of desire. This is perhaps due to my coming to infrastructure research from a background as a science fiction writer. I recall the early days of my digging into the available literature on socio-technical change and asking one of my supervisors, somewhat in despair, where are the people in these theories? The late Kurt Vonnegut had an aphorism that is not only great advice for writers, but also underlines my point. Your character has to want something, even if it's just a glass of water. Because if no one had ever wanted anything different to what they already had, then why would we have ever built any infrastructures in the first place? We built these things because they enabled us to do things we wanted to do, and to do them in a way that we felt was better. Infrastructures and the technologies which depend on infrastructures are there to enable the fulfillment of human desires. We call the actions through which human desires are fulfilled practices. The question of whence comes the desire to do things differently is pretty complex and beyond the scope of today's discussion, though we could possibly dig into it later. And so we arrive at social practice theory, which I will attempt to distill as succinctly as possible. We start from the idea of the practice itself. Someone wants to do a thing and they have a particular way in which they do it. Now, a behaviorist would say that the way that someone does that thing is a rational choice. Various ways of doing the thing are available, but they will choose the best option on the basis of various factors. But first and foremost, the factor of cost, whether that cost being financial, environmental, or something else, or some combination thereof. By contrast, social practice theory says that the way that someone does a thing is a function of the social meaning of the thing they want to do, of the masteries or methods they've acquired for doing it, and the various material tools to which they have access for doing it. There's another distinction I find very useful between the practice's entity and the practice's performance. What both have in common is the telos, the purpose or goal of the practice, though the exact expression of that telos is totally wrapped up in the particular meanings, masteries, and materials which form it. Let's consider briefly the practice of personal hygiene, which is pretty much a human universal. Every society or culture has some notion of cleanliness, though they vary wildly between different cultures. The practice as entity can be thought of as sort of collection or bundle of all the different ways in which the goal of achieving a socially acceptable state of cleanliness might be achieved. The goal of socially acceptable cleanliness is what unites all those different ways of doing it into the practice as entity. The different ways themselves are practices as performance. Each different way of reaching the different goals of socially acceptable cleanliness is a distinct performance of that teleological aim. One possible way to achieve one particular expression of the goal. So the way you do personal hygiene is influenced by things like your religion. Think here of Muslim traditions of washing before praying, or perhaps your nationality. And I'm thinking here of the popularity of bidets in Europe and their relative absence in the UK, but also the circumstances and demography of your upbringing. For many young people in the global north today, socially acceptable cleanliness might require multiple showers per day, especially if any sort of exercise is part of their daily routine. Meanwhile, for the dwindling members of the post-war generation who grew up when showers were rarely found in ordinary homes and when hot water was hard to come by, cleanliness might demand only a daily wash of a sink using a flannel and perhaps 1 or 2 baths a week. These social standards are in turn transmitted and enforced by family, friends, peers, and more nebulous media discourses, including journalism, advertising, and marketing materials. While the performers of all these very different practices could almost certainly rationalize their own performance of personal hygiene, if anyone were to bother to ask them to do so, the huge variance in the meanings, masteries, and materials available to them, depending on where and when and with whom they live and associate, means that their rationalizations are equally variable. And as Shove has so eloquently argued, this is why information campaigns and the promotion of, say, more efficient boilers are so ineffective at reducing household energy consumption. The behaviorist approach utterly fails to understand where behavior comes from, and thus fails utterly to make significant changes to behavior in aggregate. The point is that the performance of practices, the particular way that particular people do the particular things that they do, is hugely heterogeneous, even at fairly small geographical scales. From the perspective of infrastructure studies, this has important implications. The performances of a given practice are in part shaped by the infrastructures and technologies available to the performers in question, but the infrastructures and technologies available to the performers in question were in turn selected and implemented in response to the teleological desires of the performers themselves. There is no clear causality here. It is not a simple matter of build it and they will come, to use a film reference which almost certainly betrays my age. The thing I want to take onwards today, though, is that the complex geography of practices and infrastructures alike, which is simultaneously a human and a physical geography, means that infrastructure is a profoundly political matter. Now, that's probably a given for most of you, but for the sake of clarity, while any given piece of infrastructure is obviously a political matter, I'm arguing that infrastructure is also political in the abstract, especially when we start thinking about the infrastructures of tomorrow. You may be familiar with the aphorism often ascribed to the science fiction writer William Gibson: the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. The same is true of infrastructure. And when we consider that concrete infrastructure is itself the means of distribution of resources, and that one definition of politics would be that it is the question of who gets what and how they get it, then infrastructure starts to look not just political, but in fact foundational to politics itself. This is also to make a distinction between politics and policy, a distinction which has been almost entirely erased in the prevailing discourse of what we might variously label late capitalism, neoliberalism, capitalist realism, blah, 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 blah. The distinction is much the same as that I made earlier between the behaviorist supply-side perspective and the practice-focused demand-side perspective. Policy is fundamentally a managerial matter, the governance of economies as if they were, and using much the same methods as, large corporations, with a concomitant God's eye view, per Haraway, of people as idealized and supposedly rational human resources. By contrast, as I said before, politics is the question of who gets what and how they get it. I'm also going to argue here that politics is fundamentally oriented to the future, because it is always about proposing that things might, indeed should, be different. I've written about this in more detail elsewhere, and time is short, so I will be brief. The political narrative which hinges on future tense constructions such as we will, we should, we must, is thus always implicitly a prophecy, a promise, or a speculation. The political manifesto then, regardless of its ideological underpinnings, is always utopian in form. And this has been the case since at least the Enlightenment, a period in which futurity was secularized away from eschatology, and in which, perhaps not coincidentally, the concrete infrastructures started their arc of development to the present day. Another point I've made at greater length elsewhere is that imaginaries, whether socio-technical or climatic, I consider them to be essentially the same thing, only seen from different angles. Different imaginaries are also essentially utopian forms, collectively held narratives of futurity in which things are done differently. The problem is that while technologies like the internet have made some difference, the means of production, reproduction, and distribution of such narratives remains for the most part the domain of societal elites, a category in which we academics are very much included. Which is to say that narratives of futurity, also known as climate imaginaries, also known as utopias of socio-technical reconfiguration, also known as fictions of infrastructure, must be democratized. The practice perspective already discussed is essential. Without it, we are just rebuilding the infrastructural big done object all over again. Another brief water break, if you'll oblige me. Thank you. So this is the point at which I step out of the more metaphorical use of science fiction in this talk and enter briefly into the more concrete use of science fiction in my current work, namely the use of narratological techniques from SF in order to co-create stories about life in climate change futures, which are necessarily futures in which human practices have been reconfigured in various ways. And that in turn implies that they are futures in which infrastructures and the technologies that sit atop them have also been reconfigured. And that in turn, as I argued, earlier, means thinking not from a supply side perspective, or at least not exclusively or even predominantly from a supply side perspective, but from a demand side perspective. It means thinking about practices, about specific performances, about the ordinary everyday things people do and the specific ways in which they do them. And that in turn means thinking about practices in a situated way, to take up Haraway's term once more. But note that this isn't exactly a matter of thinking locally, very much in inverted commas, as opposed to thinking globally, also in inverted commas, but rather a way of thinking about the way that local actions are supported and enabled by infrastructural systems which, through their profound and irreversible mutual entanglement, are global in scale. Likewise, it is a reconciliation, or perhaps a sort of synthesis and compromise between the reductionist and constructivist perspectives. But enough of my justifications. Socio-technical futuring is political, and thus it should be democratized. It should be turned over to the people who we expect to live in the futures that are being portrayed. I will not be so bold as to claim that my colleagues and I have achieved this, nor that we are the only people heading in this unashamedly utopian direction. But nonetheless, we are working on ways to build new narratives of futurity, new utopians of socio-technical reconfiguration, in partnership with the people who will live those futures. This is difficult because, well, not so much for technical reasons, but for institutional and economic reasons. Things have been biased for so long against the inclusion of quiet and unprivileged voices in narratives of futurity that suggesting it, let alone getting it funded, is an uphill struggle. And as a side note, it turns out that even if you do get such a proposal funded, a global pandemic can prove a serious obstacle to actually going out and doing the work and getting to know the people that you want to do the work with. Nonetheless, gripes aside, this work is is utopian in two senses, or at least I see it as such. First, in the sense that it involves what Ruth Levitas refers to as the imaginary reconstitution of society, of imagining a future in which things are done differently. But secondly, it is utopian in the sense that it enacts a different and better way of doing things in the present, and allows for ordinary people, who are usually only ever the objects of elite futures, to become subjects in their own futurity. Those are a couple of recent projects we've done here at Lund, both of which inform the one that my project, which the pandemic has so far blocked me from making a lot of progress on. I will let you know how it goes when it goes. So that's the practical SFS toolkit stuff. I started this by talking about the big dumb object, and we should get back to that. How does it connect to the work I've just been describing? So, way back in 1962, in an essay entitled The Hazards of Prophecy, the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke proposed 3 laws. The first 2 aren't very well known, but I expect many of you are familiar with the third, which states that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Now, to be clear, Clarke was not claiming that magic and technology are the same thing. Rather, he meant that those untrained in either system would have no ability to distinguish them. Unless you've been shown how they work, both systems are opaque. They generate seemingly impossible outcomes, and they conceal the way in which those outcomes are achieved. Technology is not magic, but then magic isn't really magic either, certainly not for Clarke, who was a serious rationalist and believed that all occult phenomena could be and should be explained by scientific reasoning. So when Clarke says magic, and when I say magic today, we do not mean Gandalf, we mean this other guy. Magic as in stage magic, magic as illusion, magic as a trick performed for a willing audience, magic as technique. Both the magician and the technologist must keep the technique of the trick a secret, because the mystery is what hooks the audience. The miraculous will always win over the mundane. If it's nice to be given a large bunch of flowers or a cold drink on a hot day, it is more impressive to be given a large bunch of flowers or a cold drink on a hot day that appeared instantly, as if from nowhere. Magic sells. Magic is operationalized desire, operationalized libidinality. Magic is the fulfillment of manufactured desires, the management of expectations. And my claim here is that the meta system is, from the point of view of the consumer, a medium of magical provision. But there is a clear consequence to the ever-increasing range, power, and ubiquity of this seemingly magical machine, this big dumb object that we all inhabit. Its magic requires that we consume distant resources and send away waste. As a globalized cyborg collective, we are now all dependent upon and irredeemably part of a complex and effectively global system of systems, which provides us resources and services on demand and conceals the manner in which that provision is achieved. Or, to put it another way, infrastructure is a colossal magic trick that we have successfully played upon ourselves. We look at our smartphones, our light bulbs, and our plumbing, and we assume that basically that's where all the work is happening, but in fact they are merely the site at which the work is delivered to us. This lets us pretend that the environmental destruction of which we're vaguely aware is somehow not really our fault. Our consumptions appear to have no consequences, because those consumptions happen somewhere else, somewhere off stage, we might say. But it takes a lot of work behind the scenes to get the rabbit into the hat. Remember how I said that infrastructure conceals the consequences of our consumption? Well, this is what the backstage process of modern infrastructural magic looks like. Magic is extraction. Magic is exploitation. Magic eats up the earth in places we never go. Magic eats up people we'll never meet. And all because we'd really like to watch that new movie right now, to have that new dress to wear tomorrow night, to have a long warm shower anytime we like. The meta system, the infrastructural hyperobject, is the machine through which we collectively make climate change. It is the machine through which we inscribe the wounds of the Anthropocene on the body of Gaia. Karl Marx made the point I'm now making, and he made it 2 centuries ago. In the introduction to Das Kapital, he described capitalism as being like a magic cap that fools us into thinking that technology and capital is productive, when in fact productivity is the result of the combination of labor with resources. Concrete infrastructure in the abstract, didn't feature much in Marx beyond some references to the means of communication. But I would argue that it's exactly what Guy Debord was thinking about when he wrote The Society of the Spectacle. Just as the big dumb object is both figure and ground in a metaphor for infrastructure, the metasystem itself is both figure and ground of the spectacle, the means and the ends of its production, distribution, and consumption. The spectacle is the veil we draw across the consequences of our consumption, and the movie we project onto that veil to entertain ourselves while the world burns. Or, to phrase it in more theoretical language, infrastructure is the self-reification of the social natural dichotomy. Infrastructure actively effaces its own role in the magic trick of the commodity fetish because, and I fully include myself in this indictment, we all prefer it that way. But the means of civilization are not justified by the ends. On the contrary, the means are the ends. We are all parts of one another's infrastructure, all one another's magician's assistant. We are all playing our parts in getting rabbits into hats, whether we realize it or not. So time is running short, and this is a somewhat bleak place to land, isn't it? But with apologies to Donna Haraway and also Bruno Latour and many others for the drive-by conceptualizing, I will finish with the claim that we have made of Gaia a cyborg, a planetary hyperobject in which we ourselves are components. But we cannot think this hyperobject of which we are all parts, because the hyperobject itself has evolved to efface its workings from us. Our complicity is concealed. The consequences of our consumptions and excretions are effaced, taken elsewhere, conjured away. But this cyborg Gaia we inhabit, I propose, might look very much like a big dumb object to unsuspecting alien visitors. A machine the size of a planet, swarming with users and maintainers, with free riders and destroyers, none of whom could explain what the purpose of the machine might be, many of whom would be rather surprised at the notion that the machine was a machine at all. Indeed, I propose that to most humans, perhaps less so to those of us who have the privilege to study such matters, but nonetheless to us as well, this cyborg Gaia upon which we live is a big dumb object to us also, alien and alienating, inscrutable, baffling, seemingly absent of governing purpose or direction. And what I hope we might come to realize is that the alien civilization that built the big dumb object in which we wander was always already ourselves, under the influence of an alien idea, an alienating idea. I know you all know the name of the idea I'm thinking of. I suspect many of you have guessed it already. To the rest of you, I leave the particularly science fictional pleasure of puzzling out the final reveal of the story for yourselves. But no, not quite the final reveal. I want to end by proposing that the story of Cyborg Gaia as a big dumb object might turn in the final act of this volume of our story into a different science fictional trope, the Generation Starship. So Generation Starships in science fiction are vast ships designed to travel interstellar distances at sublight speeds, taking journeys of such incredible duration that they must be designed to accommodate and support the rise and fall of many generations after the demise of the ship's original designers. Those designers will, of course, make efforts to ensure that the mission of the ship, and thus the purpose of those later generations, are kept in cultural memory. But of course, it rarely works. So Generation Starships end up like inhabited big dumb objects, whose inhabitants have forgotten who made the ship, where it's going, and what they're meant to do. Often, they've forgotten that it was a ship at all, that it was an artifact. To them, it is just a world, the only world they've ever known. I am, for my sins, a utopian, and the Generation Starship trope is, to me, a potentially utopian exit from the big dumb object trope. So if you'll indulge me in one final overextension of metaphor, I believe that through our work on infrastructures, whether absolute or relative, concrete or abstract, we can come to realize, like the final generation on a Generation Starship, that what we thought was just a world is in fact also a built thing, an artifact, and that it was built not by some alien species, but by our predecessors, by people just like us. We can come to realize that, while it seems the purpose was lost, we can not just rediscover that purpose, but rewrite it, rebuild it. We can rediscover the bridge of the starship and the control panels and learn to use them. And then we can change the course on which the ship is currently flying and choose a new one. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation, Paul. For me, I feel the relationship between the two talks is that they were all about instruments, how to see future and how to see infrastructure. With Bodhi's example of how the reality is in a way too outsized and complex to be seen using realistic tools, and with Paul's example, how the multitude of all infrastructure needs something like the big object to visualize it and be able to get to grips with it. We go into the questions part of our event now. So far, we have one question for Bodhi on the chart, which I'll read out. But as a message to people listening, please feel free to post more questions as we go through this one. So the question is from Norma Valencio, and it is as follows. What path do you think fictions will take after the pandemic crisis in the context of the global south? What is, after all the challenges the poorest people are dealing with, how will this interfere in the creative process of films, books, etc.? One for you, Bodhi.
Thank you so much for that question. So I published an article on this last year. So in science fiction studies. So I could readily refer to that, which the article is called "The Pandemic That Was Always Here and After." But forget the article. Here's my simple or complex response to this, is that in a way, Global South future fictions have always been dealing with different forms of the pandemic, and that's also the reason why, some of the examples I selected, for instance, carbon, right, oxygen, or for that matter, water bottling plants and so on, which are taking out fresh water. So the directions that Global South fictions will take, my sense is that, like we are seeing way too many dystopias, and And the pandemic is a dystopia as well. If one wants to use that term acceleration, it really is an acceleration, or even for that matter, a concentration of a lot of dystopia. So these future fictions, my hope is, and my anticipation is that they will start to transform in response to the dystopian moment even more directly. So the pandemic will appear directly in fiction much more than the rather distributed nature of the pandemic. You know, like one of the things what makes COVID-19 so different from a lot of this, because if you look at the pattern of the way science fiction responds to pandemics as well, if you look at the AIDS pandemic, a lot of it transmuted into the zombie fictions of the 80s and 90s and so on, right? So there are numerous articles on the rise of zombie literature, really, with the AIDS pandemic. But the AIDS pandemic was, oh, you know, there are some people out there, there's some gay people out there who are getting this gay disease, right? So it's not something that is, you know, something that occurs, you know, across all age groups, right? The moment the pandemic starts targeting rich people, you start to see changes. So there are structural changes that happen. There are also, as I was saying, you know, more concentrations of dystopia, really. And you also get a lot of new fiction which challenges this. And that is the explosion that I have been noticing. As I said, you know, there are numbers out there of what's happening in the last 20 years in terms of science fiction, the ridiculous number of works that are coming out of Global South. I'm guessing those ridiculous numbers will be even more ridiculous, so I will stop counting. I have actually stopped counting, but just to give an example, the Chinese SF database now has like some 20,000 works, right? It's like, what? You know, and most of those are actually from the last 20 years. So what do we expect in the future? Well, much more of this, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Bodhi, for your response. Perhaps to relay on that onto, sorry, you mean to ask something or say something? No. Just to relay that on to Paul, perhaps also in relation to the pandemic, there was an increase, I guess, of the use of certain part of the big object in relation perhaps to medical infrastructure and the use of internet and what you, I think, called abstract infrastructure over the past year. Could you perhaps comment on that, whether, you know, your view on it has changed somehow due to COVID-19?
I kind of. I mean, there's. I think particularly because of the slow way publishing works. I think Bodhi's spot on when he says that, you know, a trope will emerge that speaks to the pandemic moment in particular, and the exact form it takes will be. Kind of remains to be seen. You know, I've already seen some fairly, because pandemics and transmissible diseases have been a feature of science fiction before. You know, there are fairly literal ways of addressing those questions, but the science fiction tends to get more interesting and speculative fiction more broadly when it develops a trope that allows you a metaphorical access to that question. So, I mean, you know, Bodhi's example, zombie fiction in relation to the AIDS crisis, but also urban poverty of the 80s as well, right? You know, that sense of hordes of dangerous people who are not like you, who can kill you just by being around you. And there was a lot of hay made during the noughties, people tying the resurgence of vampire fiction to the gerontocracy, right? Because the vampire is a figure for quite literally older people sucking the blood out of young people to stay alive. I won't harp too much on that one. I'm not sure it's entirely gone away, but it's not as popular a literary trope. In terms of how I would fit the pandemic into that BDO metaphor, I mean, it's the advantage, the utility of the BDO as a metaphor is it kind of, you can kind of fit anything like that into it. So if you think of the inhabited BDO, the BDO which we might realize is a generation starship, the pandemic would manifest not so much in something attacking from outside, but all of a sudden things that weren't a problem become a problem, right? There's a sense in which, and this is in no way to endorse that term, but there's a sense in which the pandemic has kind of revealed the extent to which a very Western, global, northern, mid-20th century modernity was in fact a historical blip, right? The idea that no one ever had to worry about diseases anymore, which I kind of grew up with, has just been trashed completely, right? A fundamental assumption of Western global northern modernity has just been thrown away. And not because we don't have the science, right? It's not because we don't have the tools or the knowledge. It's not because the machines don't work. It's because the organization that fits those things together doesn't work. So in that sense, if you imagine a big dumb object, which might be a generation starship, and its crew who previously didn't get sick suddenly start getting sick, that's obviously bad news. It's all of a sudden these terrible things which might be referred to in the sort of myths and legends that the crew have about the past, sort of returning to haunt them. And in the same way, I think that the Bodhi is suggesting that there will be a kind of turn against that in the literature. So I'm thinking here of Lisa Garforth's book Green Utopias, which I reviewed recently, and she talks about the importance of dystopian futures as what she calls an apocalyptic horizon against which new utopias can start to push. And to situate that idea in the big dumb object becoming a generation starship, I think this could be potentially, there is hope. I'm a utopian, so I hope. I don't do optimism. There is the possibility that when the crew start to realize, oh, hang on, we're getting sick in ways that we never used to get sick before. Something has gone wrong here. That realization that something has gone wrong is the thing that pushes those people to discover, to question their world and why it works the way it does. And when we start questioning why things work the way they do, we may start coming up with other ways that it could work. And we may start building that system in a way that is fairer, in a way that takes care of us in a different way. And to overextend the metaphor, which turns that starship in a different direction from the one we're going.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks. There's another question for Bodhi. Why do we divide by global south and north, but not east and west, or southwest and northwest? What does this divide serve, in your opinion? Not sure if I have formed the question right. Free to interpret.
Thank you very much for asking this. It's yes, absolutely. Why do we do it? And that was also the point that I was trying to make about development paradigms that have these kinds of distinctions, right? So in a lot of frameworks, for instance, what we call the global East also fits into what we call the global South, especially for countries in Eastern Europe, for instance. They're often lumped in the same bracket as global South. Sometimes they're the global East, sometimes something else happens to it. So these are extremely arbitrary classifications. And also, like when we are talking about the rise of these futurisms, for instance, Afrofuturism or indigenous futurism, these are coming out of, for instance, places like America, right, or Canada, which are very much, which would very much, or Australia and New Zealand, which would very much be in the global north paradigm. But nonetheless, these are pockets of the global north that are also producing and creating and generating these futurisms, right? A lot of the writers of these futurisms are actually settled in countries of the global north as well. And sometimes they maintain back and forth movement. Sometimes there's just exiles and there's no way of going back. So these classifications are absolutely arbitrary, but they fit into a certain kind of development narrative, which I think these futurisms are challenging, And that's the reason for taking the global south as kind of an entry point, and then using that and say, well, what do you know? I can basically ask this question even in the US, right? Because I mean, there are people who are arguing that, well, by all basic standards, the US, for instance, is a so-called third world country, right? I mean, what does that even mean? What does it mean for a place to be a third world country, right? So the arbitrariness of development paradigms is being challenged by these futurisms, and that is my answer to this. But thank you for asking that.
Yes, Tiliana, you have a question?
And I just quickly, and maybe it is a follow-up question, and maybe I am falling into that trap as well. But so two things. First thing for Paul in particular, social practice theory. So I've been engaging with this for quite a while now, and I'm still a bit on the fence about where I stand. And I wonder how the global south, and I am using this, how the global south fits social practice theory, or the other way around, because what you're looking at is essentially the complete fragmentation of the idea of infrastructure, and you do have a complete fragmentation of the idea of practice because of the many different kinds of infrastructures, types of infrastructures that serve the same purpose, and therefore the many different practices, and not even to begin thinking of performances that basically do the same thing, that can under no circumstances be thought of as the same thing. So I wonder how, if you can reconcile what to me is essentially is a complete contradiction of what social practice theory is trying to do and the realities of the global south. And my other question goes to both of you and would be a slightly provocative, so what? I mean, it's all very exciting and it's all very fascinating, and we can use science fiction to think through all sorts of problems, issues, and questions that we are challenging today, but essentially nothing changes. Because, and maybe it's a methodological question, but it would be how do we go about involving decision makers in this? How do we go about actually changing decision making and producing actual social material change in the ways in which things are being done? And I like that both of you were very, very optimistic about these things, as it seemed, or at least tried to be. Even Paul, which at some point had me rather depressed, but I do think that there is such a substantial disconnect between what we're talking about here and what is being done in the real world today. So I wonder if there's anything that we could do differently in order to produce change.
Thank you for those questions. I'll try and talk to the social practice query. I think I know what you're getting at, and my caveat here is I'm kind of a theoretical magpie. I use bits of theories and build bigger theories out of them, and so I dare say Elizabeth Shove would consider my use of her works somewhat off label, at least in certain respects. But I think but nonetheless, I maintain that sort of fragmentation, almost the atomization of practices that you're talking about. I think that's necessary. I think we have to go through that realization of the utter distinctness of things to get to what is truly common to all of them. And I didn't have time to go into this today, but what is common to all of those practices is that they require us to get certain resources and to use them and to get rid of the stuff we don't need afterwards. So this is the sense in which the infrastructural big dumb object is just a huge logistical machine. It provides, it takes away. And there's, I would need a little more time to, I think, address your question properly, but that, we have to go through that. We have to go through the bottom to get to the top, and there is an abstract commonality there, but we can only access it through the particular. We cannot we can't go the other way. If you start from the abstract and work down, as everyone does that, they kind of, you work down and you find your own set of answers, but then when you come back up, they don't match. But if you come up from the bottom, if you come up from the practice layer and meet at the top, what is truly common to all those cases should emerge. And to some extent, I mean, into infrastructure could be seen as almost a metaphor for that process, right? It is literally what lies beneath. It is the thing that lies beneath all of what we do. And to turn from that to your question of, well, how does the global South fit into that? And it was interesting to hear, let's be completely honest here, right? I'm a middle-aged white Anglophone guy living in one of the most privileged countries in Europe. It is a very difficult thing for me to speak to global Southness. I know very little of it, and most of what I know is theoretical. But I think Bodhi's point that those divisions are somewhat arbitrary and they start to fall apart when you look at them. They're just ways of drawing a line between one thing and another. I would suggest that social practice theory in general, and in particular the way I'm trying to use it, gets us at a more useful distinction, which is between which end of the supply chain any particular person is on at any particular time. And the point to be made there is that all of us are consumers, right? More so those of us here in the global north or the west, or whatever it is. Our lives are much more biased towards consumption and the concealment of the consequences thereof. But we all live under capital, right? Everyone is a consumer by, we don't even get the choice. So the practice theoretical lens lets us look at that and say, okay, well, in each action, in each circumstance, in each place, we are all consumers. Our consumptions are mediated by this huge global system of stuff. And there's a sense in which, to take a very Western perspective on it, the reason I used those images I did towards the end, that lake of toxic sludge in Mongolia, which is where the rare earth metals that go into our smartphones and computers come from, that township with the oil refinery part behind it, the woman sorting through plastic bottles, which we can't be bothered to take care of ourselves. Those are things that happen to make sure I never have to see them happen in front of me, right? That ugliness, that risk, that danger, that toxicity is hidden. It is displaced. And the logistical function of infrastructure is to enable me to do the things I do here and never have to see those consequences. They're taken away to someone who's, someone else has to deal with that. It's someone else's problem, as I've referred to it in the talk before. And so, but in that sense, but there are, as Bodhi said, right, there are divisions within divisions within divisions. There are parts of the US and there are parts of Sweden and there are parts of the UK, which are incredibly underadvantaged compared to the rest of them. There are, a very formative event in my 20s. I worked, it sounds absurd, and this is exactly the point of mentioning it. I worked as a litter picker on the perimeter of a landfill site outside Brighton for 2 weeks. And just, partly, there are many things that were deeply shocking about it, but just the realization that you don't see a landfill site normally. You have to go to it deliberately to see it. They're carefully hidden away. And obviously, I haven't checked into it, but I imagine house prices and other things in the vicinity of one are going to be extremely low compared to places that are not near a landfill site. So that southness, northness plays out at much smaller scales as well. And we are all complicit. All of us are complicit in that, right? We all consume things, and the ways in which that consumption is provided and taken care of is not our choice. But in consuming, we are complicit in that. At the same time, none of us is to blame, because this is too big a thing. You can't point the finger at anyone. And Marx's point that that sometimes gets lost in a lot of leftist discourse is, you can't, there's a sense in which you shouldn't really hate the capitalist for doing what he's doing, because it's just the way the system works, right? And that's not to excuse it exactly, but it is to explain it. Capital itself, the system under which we live, demands that those things be done. It demands increased efficiency. It demands increased throughput. There's a horrendous kind of, there's a dynamism to the thing that is way beyond any of our individual control. And the only answer to that is a collective understanding that that is the case, and a collective choice to address that issue on that basis. And to make that collective decision to change it, we have to understand it. And so to answer your final question, what use is all of this? I can't sit here and, having tried to do this with family and friends, right? Trying to explain the detailed specialist knowledges we have about this stuff. There's a reason it's taken us years to learn what we know. But stories are an ancient technology that, through the use of metaphor, through the use of tropes, through the use of narratology, through the use of character, through the use of identification, through the use of empathy, we can get a start on that. We can get people emotionally in the right place. We can access these ideas and get people on, to use a very literary metaphor, we can get people on the same page. We can get people asking the right questions. And from there, we have some sort of chance of changing stuff.
Thank you, Paul. Bodhi, would you like to answer the question about policy making and fictions?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Paul already said a bunch of wonderful things. I want to add my 2 cents to this. One is, why are we so interested in instrumentalizing futurist thought? That would be my question to you. Why are we, the moment we hear of an alternate imaginary, we think of instrumentalizing this alternate imaginary for the purposes of doing something or making some real world change or something like that? This is a way in which a lot of fiction does work. And I mentioned prototype fiction. Prototype fiction is one example of this kind of instrumentalization of narrative. Brian David Johnston at Intel, right? I mean, you can expect the Intel guys to come up with something like this, or you can expect the Microsoft guys to come up with something like this, like the prototype fiction. Oh, let's prototype these features, right? So there is an instrumentalized version of this. There is also a much more, I would say, profound, but also simpler way, which is the power of the narratives to make imagination more flexible. And that, I think, is where the whole trick comes in. Imagine the idea of a narrative like the one that Elon Musk and Muskian figures spew all the time. And the force of that narrative, the power of that narrative. Oh, we're gonna go to Mars. Oh, damn, we're gonna go and colonize Mars. Yes, right? And the kind of fervor that it generates amongst a lot of Musk's followers and so on, right? It's empty rhetoric, but it's driven. That force of that narrative, it is just a narrative. That narrative drives capital. That narrative drives the hundreds of thousands and millions of followers that he has, right? So narrative has that power, right? So narratives are not always, they're not innocent narratives. Some narratives have very instrumental functions. Some narratives simply want to make imagination more flexible. What if we could think of the world differently, right? So what if we could think of what is the wanted or the unwanted differently, right? Michel Serres talks about, trash a lot. He's spoken about the value of the parasite, about trash, etc., right? And what if our model for the world did not depend on making some other remote place dirty? What if it did not depend on pushing all our trash to the global south? Or what if we didn't have to send it to China, right? So what these narratives do is that they basically throw this in your face, right? Because the thing is, when we are living in a world when these narratives are basically thrown in our face, and that's also the question earlier about the pandemic, right? This is basically just thrown in our face constantly. And then what do? How do we deal with them? Right? So then narrative also gets a kind of, or the potential for a recuperative function, right? It's imagination, and I wouldn't say cathartic, I would say recuperative, right? It says, well, what if we think differently? What if we were not so involved in sending all our trash where it can't be seen, right? What if we were thinking about waste management differently, right? Or we have a resource-strapped environment. What if we could, instead of getting the latest gadget or the latest techno fix to fix this mess, what if we could repair this? What if we could think of changing our paradigm of dealing with what is broken, right? So that's the power, that's the force, and that's the power of these narratives and these global south narratives, because they are dealing with these landscapes. So I wouldn't say that they are necessarily, that the whole, there are arguments to be made that sometimes some of these developmental narratives are very top down rather than bottom up. And a lot of these fictions, they also try to think with communities and so on and so forth, which is true to a certain extent. There is that. So in addition to the narratives, I would point out the narratives that are about these narratives as well. So not just the fictions, but also what is being spoken about these fictions. What kinds of communities are being formed around these fictions? What kind of imaginary communities, what kinds of futures are being developed? You see this fiction, but you're not actually interested in the fiction. You're interested in the community that is reading this fiction, right? So the narratives that are also about these narratives are just as equally important. So there's a paper of mine coming out in 2 months, which is on these meta-theoretical frameworks, which are manifestos of futures and possible futures that are all from the last 10 years and from the global south. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Bodhi. I think from what you're saying that, sorry, Paul, go on.
I just wanted to kind of to put a caboose on Bodhi's point there. I wanted to do so by referring to one of the examples he raised in his own talk, which is I think a really sort of pinpoint attack on that idea of what are these narratives for, is that moment in Kunzi where it says, "I'll take your dream suppressants now." Artists recognize the power of being allowed to dream. And that's what this is about, first and foremost. I mean, I'm as much involved in that process of instrumentalization as anyone else, partly because that's the way the system in which we do this work is arranged, but partly because I think there is a utility to it as well. I think that there is more than just the right to dream that matters about this, but the right to dream, the right for ordinary people to dream that things could be different, is tacitly forbidden. And that moment in that film makes that point so beautifully and painfully. And that is exactly the point that I think, I'm putting words into your mouth here, Bernie, but I think that is the point that you're making, and it is in a way the point I'm making as well. That right to imagine the future, the question of whose future is it, right? The question of who gets to be a subject in that future. That's the question, that's why it matters.
I felt from Bodhi's response that the emotional response, rather than rational, the emotional response to science fiction has significant influence on how things would change depending on that. Also, relating to your talk, Paul, that you can always think of it as an objective God architect about people's actions and how certain scenarios will play out. I had a question for you, Paul, as well. I was thinking whilst you're presenting, what would be a very pragmatic way to apply this theory, and perhaps again, perhaps I'm thinking way too instrumental as an architect about this. But the question I had is in relation to sort of a task I was given some time ago. With there are a chain of department stores all across the United Kingdom that have gone bust and became big empty buildings right in the centers of many towns, in a way creating this sort of very big nationwide object, quite dumb in modern ways, sort of upon us, and we don't know how to deal with it. And we as architects, slightly in a sort of rational God view, start thinking, right, what do people like to do these days, and what's good for the society, what's good for the environment. You know, people like to exercise, they like the recycling. They're going to suddenly come to all these places and do exactly that. Now, my question would be more, you know, we wouldn't have time to go and think it through, but more about the approach from the point of a this big object perspective, and thinking about the users with perhaps with their emotions and different trajectories this might take. What would be the approach to this kind of problem?
Yeah, trying to keep it brief. Yeah, because you know it's a very it's a complicated question, right? But I think the key to it is in the way you phrased it. In a way, you sort of said, it's well, we need to work out what people would like to do with this. I mean, go and ask them, right? Go and ask them. And the thing is, and there's an extent to which this is, because architecture is constrained by the necessities of commerce as much as academia and everywhere else, possibly more so in some ways. And depending on who owns those buildings, who owns the land, what sort of political makeup the council has, the extent to which you can do this sort of work is going to be constrained. But that's if you're thinking, right, well, we need to work out what the people would like us to do with this, you are taking that big dumb object perspective. You're trying to design the machine and then leave it alone. Instead, and it's, I don't know, I encounter this problem a lot when I talk about the prospect of going and doing community climate future narratives, right? Going out and people are like, but what if people say they want to do things that we're not sure are the right thing? I say, well, that's exactly what we have to get used to, because it's their future as well, right? If I could wave a magic wand, I think you're referring to the John Lewis partnership there. The place is closed down in the UK. I've been out of the news loop. Debenhams, yeah. But so like you say, that's prime high street retail, right? A huge chain thereof. I mean, it's kind of the Debenhams hyper object, if you like. It's distributed in space in a really interesting way. But it's the question of what people have feelings and they have experience of their high streets in a way that, frankly, a lot of us don't, right? I've never been much of a high street guy myself, but so if you want to know what best to do with a high street, ask the people who use the high street, because it's theirs. That's where you start. You start at the bottom.
Okay. A question to all panelists. What is the most sticky question regarding future methodologies, in your opinion? Bodhi, would you like to take that one first? The most sticky question.
I'm not sure I understand what a sticky question is in this context.
Well, perhaps uncomfortable, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Steph, would you be comfortable to ask directly?
Okay, yeah. So I guess it's more, uncomfortable sort of, I think things that are quite stuck like what's the thing that is quite unresolvable in futures methodology? Maybe that would be a better question.
I'm not a futures methodology person. I am a science fiction person. I deal with my future fictions as fictions rather than as instrumentalized narratives of future studies. That said, I think one of the simple problems of pretty much any model is complexity. How do you deal with mind-boggling complexity of everything when you have, like future studies? Okay, I'm familiar with future studies methods and what those people are up to, but like when you just take something as simple as the future scone, right? Possible, probable, preferred, futures, and so on and so forth, or any of their various iterations, or CLA for that matter. Like these, the problem with any model is that models are ultimately reductive. And also, the moment we try to like interpret everything within that narrow model, everything just doesn't work ultimately, and this is also the point at which a lot of these futurisms are coming up, and they're saying that even something as narrow as the genre box of science fiction doesn't work for us. This is not science fiction. We're not going to do science fiction. We're going to have futures, but it's not science fiction, right? This future has magic. This future has fantasy. This future has something else. This future has Abhayala. It's mix of things, right? So even the generic narrowness of something like science fiction falls apart the moment you start looking at it. So the narrowness of future studies, so the problem of future studies and narrowness is basically that it has no way of dealing with complexity. The only way of solving complexity of this planet Earth is to create another planet Earth. There is no other way. So that's its problem, and that's its limitation.
And interestingly, that's a problem that Douglas Adams illustrated perfectly in Hitchhiker's Guide, right? You can solve the problem of what the meaning of life on Earth is like by making an entire other Earth, and that will eventually give you the same answer. I think there's so many ways you could answer that question, and I think in a way, Bodhi's answer has kind of revealed one of them. Actually, is the schism between what Andrew Curry would refer to as inductive and deductive futures. So that very kind of the sort of rational and projective, extrapolative, model-based futures approach, and the much more sort of creative narrative-based stuff that we're working with. You could be flippant and say that the stickiest question of methodology in futures is why the hell do we need to stick to just one? As I've already said, I'm a theoretical magpie. I think, and this is partly an academic thing, but also just a kind of force of habit thing in futures consultancy. It's, you find a model that works and you keep using it until it doesn't. But, you kind of invest a certain amount of time and experience in developing a model and getting a courant with it and being able to work well with it and so on and so forth. And you kind of get trapped in it. We all get trapped in habits of mind and structures of feelings, so to speak. So the big question I would say is why do we have to choose the one methodology to use them all? Use them in little bits, stick them together. Get lots of different approaches, I think, is a much better way of dealing with the problem. I think that's one of the ways to address the complexity issue as well that Bodhi's just talked about. There's no one method that will get you every facet of that big complex system, but each of those methods might get you a different facet, and the more facets we get, the closer we get to that impossible totality. So I guess so for me, the stickiest question is perhaps which methodology is the right one, and my get out answer for it is, well, different ones are right for different reasons. on a more personal level, the thing that I know that when I speak about futures work really tends to get people into arguments, which I think is more an issue of how the words are defined. When you talk about utopian theory in particular, and the making a distinction between optimism on the one hand and hope on the other. Yeah, I've made more people angry at me with that distinction than pretty much any other one that I've used. So I'm just not explaining it well enough. But
quite a few sticky questions. I just had a thought actually in relation to Bodhi's response to Diana's question as to how science fiction could translate into policies and real changes. And to me, and I haven't done much research into science fiction, but to me it seems almost to work in combination with other things where the sort of activism and research that accompanies it. And I this might be a little bit cliche, but I thought back to when this cartoon Wall-E was produced about that robot. I felt that would have been sort of less powerful had there not been research and all the sort of the various organizations pushing for policy changes and activists going on the streets, and this sort of picture of that more of a dystopian future with a little bit of optimism, adding as a fact into that rather than playing, purely from its own science fictional perspective. Would you say, Bodhi, that that's correct to an extent, or that in a way it's complement other streams of human activity, so to say?
I would absolutely agree, and this is also why Diana and I are still friends, because she keeps asking me this question: what's the point of this? And then I always come back with the same answer, like, well, so absolutely, this is just one way out of many ways of thinking through these problems. And sometimes it's just you need to step out of the frames that you're using already in order to realize more aspects of the problem than you would otherwise. So this is also one of the things that I think science fiction does quite well. So in that sense, it is complementary. And also I would point out to a term like, Ballard called it architecture fiction, right? That science fiction is architecture fiction. And that is recognizing that there is an inherent affinity between the way in which science fiction world building and architectural building works, right? So it's so these are complementary methods, and there are many things that I think that they share. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Okay. Well, I don't believe there are any more questions. There's probably last chance if anyone does. Otherwise, we'll gradually wrap up, I think, at this point. Thanks very much to everyone who is involved in this, to speakers, to the audience.